Hi, good morning. What interests me about architecture more than anything else is actually our impact on the social infrastructure of our society. What I'm interested in is creating community and creating conversation. This talk is in tribute to the brave people of Turkey who taught us how important architecture in its broadest sense is. Just a few months ago, in Gezi Park in Istanbul, the citizenry was told by the government that their sacred, blessed, wonderful place, full of trees and light and wonderful conversations, was going to be taken away to create a shopping center. And what struck me is that those people supported architecture in a way that has really not happened to us before, and it motivated me to talk to you about this today. And now we go back almost 400 years ago. The great Dutch painters really glorified the beauty of the most simplest of life: conversations, relationships, appreciation of the world around us. And pardon me, to me, they talked about four basic principles: solitude, but content solitude; being on your own, but being in an environment that allows you to be on your own. So you see the light coming through the windows, you see the painting behind the woman, the texture of the wall. That physical environment, that architecture, allows her to have that content solitude. And then we want to create attentive listening. You can see this couple are really listening to each other. They're not just talking, they're hearing each other, partly because of the space that they are in. And then this painting by Vincent van Gogh, a little more than 125 years ago, talks about engaging in a group, which to me is a very important part of the design of the spaces that we do. You'll see that there's 5 people in this group, but yet they are not only talking to each other, they're also on their own. And the notion is that that light above them illuminates their faces and allows them to communicate in a much warmer, physically warmer, and emotional way. And then architecture really needs to be a part of a neighborhood. To me, a building that stands alone in the landscape and becomes an icon in and of itself is not successful. It may be successful as a piece of sculpture, but not as a piece of architecture. So a building that becomes a part of the neighborhood, to me, is the goal for our work. What's interesting is these 4 states of being, if you will, happen, I believe, in all the successful spaces that we're in. You probably never think about it, nor would you have cause to. Hopefully now you will. Is that successful architecture allows for all these things to happen. So you see the individual standing alone, sitting alone. You see the couple talking in attentive listening. You see a group of people, some listening to each other and some not, and they're a part of the landscape of the neighborhood. This building that we designed in Park Slope, Brooklyn, was designed for people who have various special needs and needed to be in a more supportive environment. And our goal for this project was to weave it into the neighborhood. And what we did was a series of different devices, including issues of scale and color, but yet we very much wanted to be an iconic place in the neighborhood. And what you see here is that the way that the light shines against and dapples the textures of the building, against the reflections against the glass, the various materials that we used, I think helped to weave it into the neighborhood, in that, as you can see these girls moving through it, there's something about the physicality of the building that brings down the scale of the building that allows people to feel that's a part of their environment. Creating those social networks in a neighborhood really begins inside out and inside in. So for example, in this case, you see the lobby from the sidewalk, through the lobby, out into the open space. And then when you're on the sidewalk, what we chose to do was to pull the building away from the neighboring building by about 15 feet. What that allowed was for the people in the neighborhood to see into this building that they were very frightened of because it was supportive housing, and for the people in the building to feel that they were part of the community, which is very much a part of the healing process. This picture of the little girl, I think, encompasses what we were trying to do, which is that hopefully there is a sanctity to the space that she's in. The building physically envelops her, but yet she has this connection to the neighborhood. The irony of this is that this architectural, I would say, method created tremendous community opposition in that the community did not want to have this project at all. And by having a building open to the community almost killed the project. And it was through a lot of name calling and then hopefully a lot of negotiation that resulted in the building happening in the first place. But it's very interesting that architecture really became a part of the fight that was really nothing about architecture. And the same way that little girl in the larger environment, one hopes we look at the clock in Grand Central Station, this magnificent, magnificent space, which most of you probably don't realize is 120 feet tall. That's the height of a 12-story building. But what is it that makes this space humane? What makes it humane is the clock. The clock is only 13 inches in diameter, though, as we know, it has 4 faces, and it is up from the floor only 7.5 feet. What I believe is it's that differential between the very, very human scale of the clock and the vastness and the majesty of the space that makes it so memorable. And it also makes it really easy to find. There's probably many of you in the audience who said, meet me at the Grand Central Clock. And that's because of that scale difference. This office was designed for the State Office of Mental Health, which is the state agency that supervises the mental health services in New York City. And these people are under a significant amount of stress based on the decisions they make and the people that they have to deal with. And the decision that we made here to allow to create a community amongst those people was to bring in a significant amount of light and to use the vertical circulation, because it's a multi-storied space, as a way of creating what we call incidental interactions. That's when people bump into each other, sometimes physically, sometimes by purpose, so that conversations can happen that are not programmed. What happens in office environments often is that people are in conference rooms and they have meetings, and when they talk to each other, it's always in these very strict parameters. By allowing for incidental interactions, people get to talk to each other before and after the meetings. They can ask about things that have nothing to do with the meeting, and they can develop a rapport with each other. The interesting story about this is that this office opened on September 10th of 2001. And you know what happened on September 11th. And this became, for a year and a half, not the offices we designed, but actually the hub of all the mental health services in New York City. And for that, I feel very lucky that we were able to have that space ready for something that we never, obviously, ever designed for. And just like Mr. Wright, who I also think thought about incidental interactions, if you think of the Guggenheim, it's a very different museum than many others, primarily because it's not just about watching the art, it's about watching each other. So based on the ramp design, you can watch people watching the art, the people watching the art can watch you, and then from a distance, you can see the whole community of people watching the art. So there are some painters who hate to be in this space because they find it's distracting to their work. For me as an architect, I think it's a wonderful way to create a community of people who love art. This is a recent project that our firm did called Making Room, which was an exhibit at the Museum of the City of New York, who talked about alternative housing models for New York City based on our burgeoning population. And Amie Gross Architects was a part of the team that created the micro unit, which was a full-size 325 square foot apartment that was designed to be inhabited by 1 or 2 people. And what our challenge in the office was obviously is how do you create a comfortable space where people didn't feel crowded, but yet provided the amenities that we expect from where we live. And the way that we approached that was by creating what we call areas of dwelling. The idea is to create discrete areas with very, very few walls where different activities happen, starting at the entry and moving through the kitchen into a dining area, storage space, seating and sleeping, a desk area, and then out again into the neighborhood on the terrace. What was fascinating to me is to watch people walking through the space, and I expected them to really be responding to that there was a lot of room. What they actually liked is that there wasn't a lot of room, but it wasn't crowded. Many people spoke about the fact that their possessions possess them, as opposed to having possessions. They spend too much of their time buying, storing, figuring out, and renting square footage for things as opposed to themselves. And I think part of the success of this, one hopes, is that it will allow people to exist in their space full of life and breath so that their possessions mean less and the activities that happen in the space mean more. But I have to say the most amount of pride that we got from this is that this small space is 100% handicapped accessible. And at the opening, the two men that run the Mayor's Office for Disabilities were there in their wheelchairs. And I literally did not breathe as they wheeled around the space. And then they came over and shook my hand. And this has never happened to me in my career. I just broke out in tears. And I never realized how much I was nervous about this being accessible to everybody until that experience happened. And when I talked about Vermeer, and we often forget that the tools of an architect are the tools of the artist. We deal with foreground, middle ground, and background. In the same way that I talked about the beginning of the solitary individual, the small group, and the larger group. The notion is to architecture, as is reflected in our own life, should bring us through various stages of living. And that's what we tried to do here, is by how one enters the unit and sees these discrete areas of dwelling. But as you see, the way the bread is organized and the way the windows project onto the street, the windows make it part of the neighborhood, and the organization of the bread takes this tiny space and makes it feel not crowded, but actually cozy. But there's a side story about this bakery that ties up everything that I'm talking about, I think. Yesterday in the office, I wanted to make sure that this bakery was still around, so when I showed it to you, I would let you know that you could go see it yourself. It turns out that the baker, whose name you see here, Mr. Napolito, who owned this bakery for about 70 years, was the chair of the Land Use Committee of Community Board 2 in Greenwich Village. In the 1960s, Robert Moses tried to take Fifth Avenue, which, as you know, runs up to Washington Square Park, and push it all the way through the park and thereby destroying it. This lovely little baker that everybody thought was just this unassuming man, turns out was a shark. And he got, in a very good way, he got Eleanor Roosevelt and Jane Jacobs, and they created, in a sense, what they are doing in Gezi Park. And we have Mr. Napolito and Eleanor Roosevelt and Jane Jacobs to thank for the fact that we still have Washington Square Park. For me, though, to be an architect, our number one job is to create joy. Obviously, we need to create joy in beautiful spaces. It's not just enough to say we want joy. And if you create joy, then obviously you're creating the opposite of that. You're also allowing for sadness, and you're allowing for a range of emotions. But what motivates me as an architect is to think about the people that will use our spaces and to make sure that those spaces allow for the kind of joy. In this case, this is one of the oldest indoor swimming pools in New York City at a settlement house in the Upper East Side. And the Upper East Side is one of the wealthiest parts of the United States. It's also one of the poorest parts. And so the people who run the non-for-profit that organized this settlement house made a decision to have a sliding scale for the rates to get them into their athletic club, which includes the pool. So they created neighborhood. They created neighborhood by allowing the full neighborhood that lived there. And this is one of the only locations in the neighborhood where people that cut across all income brackets can actually get together. And it has created relationships that I believe would not have happened before, based on the space being there and the way it's designed, and most importantly, the policy that our clients implemented. This is my favorite picture. This is what keeps me going sometimes when things get rough, when you're in community board meetings and people scream at you. This is Genesis Neighborhood Plaza, which is a housing project in East New York for survivors of domestic violence. The children that you see in this picture and their parents have been through a lot. And the day that we photographed this, it was an extremely, extremely hot and humid day, and the fountain was going on, and nobody was in the fountain. So I walked over to the girl with the big smile on her face, but she didn't have a big smile on her face at that time, and I said, "What's going on here? I don't understand. Why aren't the kids in the fountain?" And in a very quiet voice, she said, "Well, we don't have any bathing suits." My first instinct was, I didn't think about that as an architect. It didn't even occur to me that somebody might not be able to use what we do because of something that they don't have. So after I sort of recovered from that, I said, well, why don't you go upstairs and talk to your mom and see if there's a way that you have something you can wear that she's okay with getting wet. She became the Pied Piper. All the children that you see in that picture followed her, and within the time it took for me to sort of absorb what happened, they were back. And there they were enjoying this amazing, amazing scene. So what motivates me about this is not just the beautiful landscape architecture designed by Mr. Smith and the environment that we created, but more than anything that the environment allowed for this neighborhood and community of children to enjoy themselves. And now we end where we began, in Taksim Park. And this is, to me, the ultimate of community. This is in between the various protests that still go on to this day, and you understand why these people chose to fight the way that we did. I hope those people are an example for us all, that to be activists and to be demanding about the spaces that we occupy, be demanding of our community, of our government leaders, of the architects that design spaces for us, that what we want above and beyond anything else is a conversation. Thank you very much.